I'll start it with it off and then I'll just turn it on.
Okay. All right.
It.
Good morning,
Okay.
good afternoon, everybody. I have Katie Mahoney here with me. We are so excited that you are part of this session. And I know that we're going to have some just really great information from Katie today. This session is called Mental Health Awareness and Support in Volunteer Programs, something that is always important, particularly timely, just as we are walking through 2020. Really looking forward to what she has to share with us today. I want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. There she is. So if you'd like to make the presentation larger or smaller on your screen, you can press Control and the plus sign, or Command on the plus sign and the plus sign on your Mac. You can also do the minus sign if you want to make it a little smaller, just some ways to adjust your screen. We don't have public chat enabled, but Katie is happy to answer any questions that you might have. You can put that in the Q&A box. I'll be reviewing that and she'll be stopping periodically to answer questions. So really hoping that you all will just bring anything that you were hoping that she might be able to speak to, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can also minimize your chat window. There's a downward arrow there if you want to make things bigger. The session will be recorded and session materials will be available. If you go back to agenda and you click on this session, you'll see a speaker bio for Katie, and then you'll also see documents, and you'll be able to get a copy of this presentation there. It is not available in the handout section of this particular here in the session. And then afterward, we really hope you'll take a moment to complete a session survey. If you click on event in your account, you'll see surveys as one of the items on the menu. And then you'll see this particular session. It is only 5 questions. We would love your feedback. Katie would love your feedback. And so we hope you'll take just a second to do that afterward. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Katie. She serves as the program manager for the Seattle affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and she's been in that position since 2015. And she oversees NAMI Seattle's volunteer-led community programming, which reaches over 3,000 people a year. She holds a Master of Science in Social Work. Woohoo! That's me too. Appreciate our MSWs in the world. From the University of Texas at Austin, and has worked in the nonprofit sector for 15 years, primarily in program coordination, volunteer management, and community outreach. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Katie.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me? I guess you can't respond, but hopefully you can. Let me know if there's a problem.
Yes,
Thank you so much. Perfect. Thanks. Thank you so much for coming today. This is I give a lot of mental health trainings, and this particular one is very near and dear to my heart. I have worked in programs and social work and nonprofits for many years, and I've done some form of volunteer management through most of that. And I love talking to other volunteer managers. I love volunteer managers. I love volunteers, and I love talking about mental health in volunteer management, particularly because it's a conversation that I think we don't have often enough in volunteer spaces, and it's just as relevant there as it is in all other spaces. So I am going to be sharing some thoughts, some information, some strategies, some ideas with you today. Feel free to drop as many questions as you have in the chat box, and as was mentioned, I'll be stopping along the way to answer any questions. I am always happy to be interrupted, which you can't totally do in this format, but I'm happy to do as much kind of back and forth as possible because this is important stuff and I love talking about it. So all that being said, I am Katie Mahoney. I am the program manager with NAMI Seattle. I have been there for about 5 years in this role. NAMI, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is one of the largest grassroots mental health organizations in the U.S. We've got over 900 local affiliates across the country. So I'm with the Seattle one. But the mission of all of those local affiliates is to fill the gaps in our local mental health system through education, advocacy, support, and referral. And I want to very quickly do the land acknowledgement. I know that you're all probably mostly or entirely in Florida. I'm here in Seattle, so I will do my Seattle land acknowledgement, which is that NAMI Seattle is located here on the occupied land of the Duwamish tribe, who continue to be unrecognized by federal, state, and local governments. We honor with gratitude the land and the people. So, very quickly, I am going to start by giving just sort of a very quick background and overview about mental illness, mental health in the US, and just to let you know, and then we'll kind of get much more into the nitty gritty of how that applies to our volunteer programs. Very quickly, I want to let you know, at NAMI, we use the terms mental health condition and mental illness interchangeably. There's as many different feelings about language as there are people who use language and who have different mental health, mental illness experiences. So just to let you know, that's what I mean when I say mental health condition. Um, so just a very quick snapshot, mental illness, common and complex. It affects 1 in 5 Americans. So if you're in a room with 5 people, odds are that at least one of you is impacted by a mental health condition. The most common are an anxiety, which you can see affects a huge number of people, anxiety disorders, about 1 in 5. And then depression is kind of the next most common at about 7% of Americans. Depression across the world actually is a leading cause of disability, and mental illness, mental health itself is an incredibly complicated mix of all sorts of things. Even the people who study it and are experts in it don't really understand it. Sort of the secret. But it's a complicated interplay of genetics and environment and lifestyle and culture and trauma and biochemistry, all kind of mixing together. Sometimes more of one, sometimes more of another. Which is why there's no, um, there's no one way that mental illness and mental health conditions show up in two different people. So, all that being said, I also would be remiss if I didn't talk about mental health in 2020, because a lot of this information, some of the statistics on the previous slide were, of course, pulled from before 2020, before the pandemic, before this incredibly challenging year. And so, we'll see how things kind of evolve as we move forward. But in June 2020, there was a CDC Pulse survey taken, just sort of a quick snapshot survey taken, in which 40% of Americans reported that they were struggling with some kind of either mental health symptom and or substance use. So again, that is a really high, probably not surprisingly high, unfortunately, for many of us, but a very, very high number. Um, and as well, we always kind of talk about in the presentations that we give, really highlight the ways in which racism and racial bias, racial injustice impact mental and physical health. This presentation is focused on mental health, but I do want to emphasize that the fallout from racism and racial bias and kind of everything that goes along with it does have impacts on physical health as well, not just the brain. And some examples that have been pretty prominent in 2020: constant re-traumatization of the Black community as racial injustice and violence has kind of been thrust into the spotlight in a way that it rarely has before. Anti-Asian discrimination and violence has been on the rise since the spread of COVID, and the disproportionate impacts of the COVID pandemic, as with other kind of public health crises and emergencies on communities of color. And so all of that takes a disproportionate toll. So I am going to bring it home to volunteers and volunteer programs. I have a story very quickly from Casey, from a volunteer from Seattle. who shared with us a story about, says, I was supposed to volunteer for a local nonprofit, but I overslept. I woke up after the event that they were supposed to volunteer for had technically started. I don't know how to approach them about this. It had everything to do with my mental health and symptoms, but I feel like I can't be transparent or they won't understand that. If I tell them I had a medical condition plus my delayed response, I just worry they'll write me off as irresponsible, inconsiderate, unprofessional, or excuse laden. So this happens all the time. And a lot of times we as volunteer managers are not even necessarily aware of it. I mean, certainly at NAMI Seattle, because mental health is what we do and we talk about it all the time. I think we're probably more aware. We're certainly more aware than in other places where I've overseen volunteer programs. But even still, volunteers kind of disappear all the time, right? They no show or they come late to something or they just kind of disappear and we figure, maybe we never hear from them again, or we just figure they've forgotten or didn't care, or, maybe they got a job or we don't always know. Sometimes they tell us, sometimes they don't. And if a volunteer doesn't show up to something that they were supposed to do, I mean, I think a lot of times the experience for us is one of frustration, right? We depend on our wonderful volunteers to keep keep things rolling, right? Keep the doors open, keep our programs moving. And so if they don't follow through on a commitment that they made, we don't always have the time or the capacity because we have so much on our own plates to follow up, find out what happened, reach out to them. And if we find out that, like in this example, if they overslept, right, is our first reaction going to be, or is our first assumption going to be, oh, I wonder if they're struggling with depression, or is it going to be like, oh man, I wish they had set an extra alarm. Like I really needed them there. I was depending on them. We ended up being short staffed. So again, just kind of as we go along, things to keep in mind that these stories are happening all the time. We already have, whether you know it or not, you have minimum 1 in 5 of your volunteers lives with a mental health condition. And so just kind of keeping in mind the various ways that this can impact the ways that they engage with us. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about symptoms, common symptoms. And again, all people, as I said before, all people are different. All the different ways that mental health, mental illness show up in each of us is going to look different. Um, but there are a few common symptoms that are most common across different types of mental health conditions. And you can go to NAMI.org, which is the website of our parent organization based in Washington, D.C., NAMI.org. And they have there's a list, there's tons of information and fact sheets and ways to kind of brush up on your own mental health knowledge if you're, whether you're just a beginner or whether this is something that very closely impacts you or your family. But they have a list there of the most common, I think the 12 or 15 most common mental health symptoms. Across all different conditions and diagnoses and the rest of it. So again, just kind of reading through these, some of them maybe you knew, maybe you would have assumed already. Some of them like physical problems without obvious causes or changes in eating habits, difficulty concentrating. Some of those aren't necessarily ones that would like jump to the front of our mind as like, oh, that's definitely connected to mental health. And it's not necessarily. There's all sorts of things that can show up in these different ways, and we never know someone's exact kind of mental health situation unless they tell us. But these are just kind of some basic things to be aware of, to keep an eye on. If something starts showing up in one of your volunteers, if one of these, especially if there's a change, if one of these seems like it comes out of nowhere and all of a sudden they're experiencing one of these, or if they were all along, just something to be aware of. There might be some mental health conditions, symptoms, struggles going on there that you may or may not ever find out about. And so, how do these show up? How can these show up? And I'll stop actually after this one. I welcome, as I said, any questions, and I'll pause after this section just to give you all a chance to ask any questions that you might have. But other ways that it can show up as well that aren't necessarily immediately recognizable to all of us as being connected to someone's mental health. Um, frequent no-shows or tardiness, black and white thinking, meaning, very either or, something is either this or that, no nuance. They just have really struggled to kind of embrace the gray area or the possibility that two things could be partly true at the same time. What are some other ones I want to highlight? Lack of empathy is a really challenging one. I'm sure we all know someone in our lives who we really struggle to connect with, and it just feels like they have very, very little empathy for us or for others. This isn't necessarily, lots of people, this can be associated with being on the autism spectrum. It's not inherently, a bad or negative or terrible thing, but it can play out in really challenging ways, especially for us, I think, working in social service fields, and we're sort of used to folks and working with volunteers too, right? It's a really rewarding and challenging job. And so we're used to um, expecting folks to have compassion and really work from this place of understanding and compassion. And so it can be challenging when there's a struggle or when there's a disagreement. If you're feeling like the person you're talking to is just not approaching the conversation from a place of empathy. And so really understanding that this is just, again, it doesn't have to have a value attached to it. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, it's, very frequently connected to mental health conditions. Um, Loss of interest. Oh, sudden increase or decrease in productivity. I also wanted to highlight, especially if that changes, not just decrease productivity, but like increase. Suddenly they're volunteering around the clock. They're volunteering for all these different opportunities. They're doing the work of three volunteers. They are just it's amazing. And I think, again, as volunteer managers, we have so much on our plates that when we find these magical unicorn volunteers who are doing a ton, it's hard for us to remember to cut them off, right? To say like, hey, hang on, I don't want you to burn out. Um, and if they say, no, I'm fine, I can totally do it. What's your inclination? Is our inclination to keep talking to them about it to kind of push the issue, or is it to say, okay, great, well, I trust you, and maybe they know themselves, and maybe they don't, right? Just like all of us, sometimes we're more kind of in touch with what's going on in our own capacity and our own energy, but sudden increase in productivity um, can can be very frequently associated with like the manic phase of bipolar or managing an anxiety disorder, or just kind of keeping yourself busy and going a mile a minute. And so again, something, because we love our volunteers, we want to take care of them, we want to make sure they don't burn out, and we want to make sure that we're not providing them a platform to really to kind of go and go and go and go and then crash and have it impact their health and their well-being and all the rest of it. Fatigue, difficulty concentrating, increased accidents. I think the most of the rest of these are potentially self-explanatory. I see there's at least one question. I will pause here. What questions do you all have? What do you want to ask or point out or know more about regarding mental health and symptoms and all the rest of it before we get into kind of the more nitty gritty? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go ahead and share Laura's question.
Perfect.
This is great. How do you recommend initiating a conversation when you suspect a possible mental illness is affecting someone's capacity to serve? Do you focus strictly on the behavior without acknowledging, mental illness and hope they bring it up, or, what do you recommend? Great question.
Totally. Yep, that's such a good question. And I'm going to talk about difficult conversations a little bit more later, but since we're here, um, it's tricky with when I give these presentations, when I give these trainings in workplaces, because it's a little more kind of the legal and health issues are a little bit more clear cut. We always recommend starting out just with like observations of the behaviors, right? Like, hey, I've noticed blah, 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 or I've seen this happening, right? So just like what you've seen, what you've observed, what you've experienced is the first piece of it. Next piece of it is why does it concern, why are you concerned about it? So, this has me a little worried because blah, 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 blah. Um, and then the final piece of that, which again, it depends on your organization, it depends on your relationship with the volunteer, it depends on your own kind of personal experience. But, I would say if there are, again, we can't make guesses about someone else's mental health. It's not appropriate to, anyways, right? Regardless of the legality of the issue, or kind of the professionalism aspects. It's just we never know what's going on, and we don't need to know, right? What we're dealing with is the actions and the conversations and the behaviors and the things that are in front of us. And so, but in terms of your own personal experience, if there are, whether it's your own mental health, whether it's something you've seen in a family member or a friend or a colleague or, anything else, there are ways, if you're comfortable and if you feel like it's appropriate, I would say there's certainly ways that you could pull examples or stories in, or, this, or even, from other volunteers, like, hey, this has me a little worried because blah, blah, blah. This actually, sometimes I've worked with other volunteers where this was the case, or like, my brother does this, or I do, I tend to be the same way, sort of weaving that in. And there, it can be tricky because again, none of us want someone else to kind of assume what's going on with us, right? And so I think the balance is presenting it in a way where you're not saying, I know what's going on because I've seen it in this other totally unrelated person, and I know that's going on with you. But I think again, a lot of us are impacted by mental health conditions, either personally or in our lives, and I think that just gives us extra insight and experience and knowledge. And I don't think it's inappropriate at all to weave that in if there's a way, depending on the situation and your relationship with them, if you feel like it would kind of bring some insight and complexity to the conversation rather than just having it be a strictly like, hey, you were late, I'm worried because you need to do your volunteer role, which again, I know none of you would do. You are all lovely people. Um, but the other piece of that is, and again, I'll get into this a little bit more later, but if you are personally someone um, who lives with a mental health condition and you think like, oh, I'm recognizing some things going on with this volunteer that resonate with me. Again, not saying I know that this is what's going on with you, but sharing your own personal experiences or stories, or even just mentioning like, hey, I live with bipolar, or hey, I have an anxiety disorder, in the context of this or any other conversation, is huge in kind of in setting that tone and building that culture where the volunteer is more likely to feel comfortable sharing what's going on with you. And if they let you know, again, like with Casey's story, the barrier was not being able to share what was going on, right? Like, every mistakes happen, things happen, we can work through those. But the sort of the breakup with the organization came because Casey was not comfortable sharing what was going on because they didn't feel like they would be understood or acknowledged, or that that they would find sympathy or support, or that they wouldn't burn that bridge, right, by sharing that information. So I think if you can bring it up yourself, either when there are struggles already happening or symptoms or possible symptoms that you observe, or just in general when we were working with volunteers, just kind of casually weaving that into conversations lays that groundwork. So when there is a conversation, you say, hey, I see this going on. I'm concerned because blah, blah, blah. What's going on? How can I support you? If it does have to do with their mental health, then they're more likely, right, to let you know that if you've already kind of done that groundwork. There's a few other things, but I'll save them for the conversations piece. But hopefully that helps with a little bit. Were there any other questions before I go on?
Not just yet.
Perfect. Okay. Again, feel free to drop them in as we go. So this is more of a reflection question. Think about, or maybe you already have been thinking about, but I would love for all of you to just kind of think of a time that you worked with a volunteer who seemed like they were experiencing um, any of those features, any of those behaviors, any of those symptoms that we just talked about. So kind of go through your volunteer experiences, pick out one example. You may have many, many examples. Pick out one, and just kind of think about what was the situation. Kind of isolate, try and remember, how did others react to them? How did you react? How did you feel about it? And then kind of think about what might have helped you and what might have helped them in that situation. And again, sometimes we talk about this sometimes in when I do these live, but for now, just kind of reflect on it. If you have questions that stem from that, I would love. You're more than welcome to drop them into the Q&A. But just does this, kind of highlight or does it illuminate any past volunteer situations where because this happens all the time, even with me, right? We were really focused on the impact and the outcome and kind of the challenges that arose in our work. But now, does it add any extra insight to what might have been going on with them and what some of the backstory might have been with their own mental health, knowing that these symptoms, these behaviors, these just these different ways of it showing up are super common and pop up all the time and aren't always recognizable to any of us as being connected to a mental health condition. So now we're getting into the communication portion, and then we'll get into more of the tangible strategies. Talking about these difficult conversations, these are also different ways that mental health conditions can play out communication wise or in ways that you can observe when you're working with a volunteer. So just a very quick cheat sheet. I'll make this available afterwards, I think, as well, and during the presentation as well. I think it's available for you all to share the slideshow. But some recommended approaches if any of these things are going on with your volunteers. So if someone is feeling easily overwhelmed, just remember to limit their input. Don't force a discussion on them. If someone is frequently changing their plans, you don't have to change them. You don't have to change yourself. Just kind of stick with your commitments. Be that consistent presence, yourself and the organization, in their life. If they're experiencing a lot of anxiety or insecurity, just stay calm, be accepting. If they are demonstrating poor judgment, or what in your opinion is poor judgment, don't expect rational discussion is what I've got there. I want to explain that a little bit. I'll use an example. If I make a decision that someone else observes and they think that is not the best decision. That is not a decision that they would have made. And so they see me doing it, or they find out it's what I've done. Them explaining to me in rational terms why that was not a decision that I should have made is not going to make me necessarily change my mind or my behavior or think, oh yeah, you know what, you're totally right. You just presented me with some solid arguments about why I made a bad call. Over time and in different ways and in over multiple conversations or during the course of our relationship, I absolutely might become very open to changing my mind or recognizing that maybe it wasn't the best decision at the time. But in the moment, or at the time when I'm making a decision, we're in it. There's a lot of emotions there. It's not a time when I or anyone can be kind of rationalized or logicked out of the decision that we're making, which again, we always make what the best decision for us at the time using the information that we have, right? And so it may not be someone else's version of a good decision, but we're always making decisions based on the emotions and the information that we're experiencing at any given moment. All of us are, right? So just kind of in a broader sense, in life, this is a good good rule to live by. This reason, this rational discussion, this logic, none of that comes into play when strong feelings are involved, or when we're in the midst of a decision that's we're really in the midst of. Sorry, that was not the most eloquent way of phrasing it, but just be okay with people making choices and kind of coming to new decisions over the long term. And then again, sort of related to that, believing delusions. Delusions aren't necessarily like, you know, aliens are out to get me. Delusions can look like this other staff member at this organization hates me. A volunteer might say, so and so who works at your organization hates me. I hate, working with them because, they always think I do things wrong. Um, and this may be true. What seem to us like delusions aren't always wrong or fake or, don't necessarily have a kernel of truth. But it also, maybe we know for a fact that this person does not hate or dislike this volunteer at all. In fact, they really like them, but they say they always act weird around me. I don't know why. I think they think that I don't like them. Um, so that could be a delusion, just sort of a different interpretation or experience of reality than we have. And so the way in life, the best way to kind of address delusions is or kind of delusional beliefs or beliefs that don't line up with our own experience of reality, is to acknowledge them. Don't play into them, but don't argue with them either. So don't go. It's not helpful to go along with it if you don't experience that as the truth. It's not helpful to say, "Oh, wow, yeah, they seem like maybe they really do hate you," and to kind of be supportive of the volunteers' feelings. By the same token, it's also not helpful to argue because again, that's kind of what we just talked about, bringing that reason and that logic into trying to logic someone out of their experience of reality. And none of us wants that. None of us wants someone else to try and, give us like five good reasons why our experience of reality is not true. Um, and so acknowledging the feelings is kind of the best middle ground to support the volunteer, but also not kind of take one side or the other if you don't agree with what they're saying, just to say like, oh, that sounds really hard, or that sounds like I bet that makes you feel really awkward to work with them, or just kind of acknowledging, how can I support you, or what can we do, or is there something we can change about this because it sounds like that's really upsetting, and that we are acknowledging the truth of their feelings, but not kind of coming down on one side or the other about whether or not you think it's kind of factually true. Um, so obviously you're all here, so I don't actually need to convince y'all of any of this. Um, but why is it important to kind of approach your volunteer program through a mental health lens, kind of set up a mental health framework within your volunteer program? One, it's a matter of equity. As I mentioned earlier, you already have so many volunteers with mental health conditions, whether or not you know it. So the folks who are already volunteering for you, in addition to your coworkers, staff, your community, yourself, all of these folks are already living with mental health conditions, and often struggling in a world that is not in a world and in systems and in organizations that are not naturally in any way set up to provide support or accommodations or access or kind of work for folks who are living with mental health conditions every day. Um, and again, community served, as I mentioned, is also living with mental health conditions. And if you are with some kind of community or social service agency, um, then the volunteers who have leadership in your organization, who support your programs, your staff, all the folks working in our organizations should reflect the communities that we serve. And we know if we serve folks with mental health conditions, that should be reflected in our staff and our volunteers and our leadership. So setting up this framework really opens up space to recruit, to engage, to support volunteers with mental health conditions. And it's a matter of connection as well, building sustainable long-term volunteer relationships where people aren't disappearing like Casey because they feel like they worry that they burned a bridge or that you won't understand, or if they have to kind of take time off because they have an experience either, a depression or a more significant crisis, like they experience psychosis or go through a manic episode or anything like that. Um, and if they just feel like they won't be able to talk to you about it or come back from it, or if there's an incident, and then afterwards they just feel a lot of shame, or if that doorway isn't left open, and if that strong relationship hasn't been built, then there are lots of wonderful volunteers who may just totally sever ties with our organization because of that. I worked with a volunteer a few years ago who was giving their role was to lead presentations for community members and students. This particular um, incident I'm thinking of, they were leading a presentation for college students for a college class. And at NAMI, one of our programs is called In Our Own Voice, and folks with lived experience of mental illness get trained to share their personal stories and talk about what living with anxiety or OCD or schizoaffective or depression is like, and kind of talk about their personal experience. And so this volunteer was a wonderful volunteer, a wonderful presenter, had given many presentations. I had observed many of these presentations and knew that they were a great storyteller and really wonderful in this role. And they gave this particular presentation for a college class. And afterwards, I heard back from, I think both the college professor first reached out to me, and then the co-presenter, because there's always two volunteers presenting together. The co-presenter also reached out to me and just said, we have like it was good, thank you, it went fine, but we have some concerns. I think the professor was saying that this volunteer had shared some of their past behaviors, like substance use and other kind of behaviors, in this way that was sort of glorifying them, and had used some somewhat inappropriate language, which again, like, a few swears or anything like that, I think especially in college settings is not like, I certainly from a volunteer manager perspective don't have any issue with it, as long as everyone there is comfortable with it. But they were saying the language that was used, and kind of not just the language, but the way they were talking about it was really just kind of, again, glorifying these past behaviors, and not and sort of talking about these things in slightly concerning ways. She was saying it wasn't a disaster. It wasn't in this really horrible way, but she was a little bit on edge listening to it. And then the co-presenter confirmed that they were she had reached out to me just to let me know that this other co-presenter had been talking about things in a way that she, as another NAMI volunteer, felt like didn't wasn't appropriate to NAMI. Um, and again, I knew this volunteer. We had built up a relationship. I had talked with them. I had observed some of their presentations. This didn't sound like what I had come to expect from this volunteer. And so I reached out to them, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to have to." I got some feedback. I sort of summarized the feedback. I'm concerned. I really want to make sure that you are okay, because it sounds like this is different from what was going on before when you were volunteering, and I just want to make sure that everything is okay with you. I'm going to have to. I had to set some boundaries. I said, I'm going to have to take you off the active presenter list for now, just because I want to make sure again that you're okay, and that we're not in a situation where we're having these experiences with our presentations. But this is definitely not a permanent thing. Like, please let me know how you're doing. If you want to talk about this more, I would be delighted to add you back to the active volunteer role. I just need to take you off for now until we kind of sort out what's going on. And again, this is kind of a best case scenario. It could have gone in a lot of different directions, but in this particular case, they said, "Hey, okay, so actually, I've been struggling with." They had bipolar, and they said I've been kind of dealing with a manic phase. I've been in kind of an extended manic phase since earlier in the spring, and I thought it was kind of under control, but thanks for the feedback. It sounds I'm need to deal with things more, right? So I will take a step back. Okay, thanks for reaching out to me. And again, so we kind of they took some time off. And again, that was like the best possible scenario. I have also been like yelled at by volunteers and argued with, and boundaries can go in a lot of different directions, and these conversations can. But that was really like, it was very clear to me that something was going on. It made perfect sense once they said that they were kind of experiencing this manic phase, because again, some of the ways that they were talking about things and the stuff that the professor had reported back. So they took some time off. They ended up actually taking a lot of time off, and sort of disappearing from our volunteer ranks. And what I did was I didn't hear back from them. I reached out to them a couple months later, maybe a month or two, and said, "Hey, how are you doing?" Um, didn't hear anything back. So I waited a little bit longer, maybe 6 months later, and I kept up like a regular check in. Hey, just wanted to see how everything is going. I was thinking of you. Done. No pressure to get back to me. I just want to make sure everything is okay. Like several years later, I think it was just in this past year, I heard from a different NAMI affiliate located near in the greater Seattle area, that was not our own, that this volunteer had reconnected with them and was now volunteering because they were living closer to that NAMI affiliate then, and was volunteering with them now. Which again is wonderful, right? We don't always know where things leave off if someone chooses not to respond to our outreach, but leaving that door open, not putting pressure on someone to come back. But again, if you experience a mental health crisis of any kind, once you kind of restabilize, not only are you taking care of your own health and kind of coming back from that, but you're having to deal with the fallout of everything that happened that you did or didn't do during the time when you were in crisis, right? When you were going through your depression or a manic episode or whatever it was. And so hearing from someone, having someone reach out to you just to say, hey, no pressure. I don't want to have this be another thing that you're feeling like you can't keep on top of. But I was thinking about you. You haven't burned that bridge. That door is open for you to come back whenever you're ready. And if it's right, if it feels right, that can work wonders. That can make the difference between someone disappearing from your organization forever and someone taking care of themselves and their health and then coming back when they're ready. So this last part, these last two slides are about actual techniques. Are there any questions? Sorry, before I go on, I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, Katie, there's one
Yes,
question here. It's a
perfect.
good one. An individual says that she has a volunteer that constantly degrades himself and belittles himself and his position, expresses that he's not wanted, not good enough, and so on. And that they continue to encourage him. She continues to encourage him and express his value, but it's certainly very, very draining for her. So certainly seems
Yes,
like there's some, whether it's insecurity or beyond that she's struggling
totally.
to try to help with. If you had any thoughts.
That is a great question, and that is so hard. And I've I've worked with those volunteers before. I know I've experienced folks like that personally and professionally, and it's never easy, right? Especially particularly when you care about the person as a volunteer or in your own life. Um, I think um, we're getting to it. It sounds like you're doing what you can. You're doing all the right things in terms of being supportive and encouraging. The other piece of that your question touches on is the draining feeling for us, right? And that's so tricky because you have the right to draw boundaries, right? Like you can be kind and supportive, and we're more than just a manager. We're more than just a job supervisor as volunteer managers. We're a lot of other things too, and volunteering is a lot of things to many people. um, but you also have the right to set boundaries for yourself, and like you don't have to be someone's substitute parent or therapist or friend, or like you can set those boundaries for your role and for yourself as you need them. And so um if you, depending on who the person is and how you want to phrase this, but just at something like, I care about you so much, I'm wonderful, like I'm going to need to set a boundary about you, like not making these comments to me or in front of me. Again, phrase it however is appropriate for you and their relationship. And you don't have to necessarily frame it as it's taking a toll on me, right? Because it's not, you don't want to make it about you, but that boundary is your way of taking care of yourself so that it's sustainable for you to keep taking care of this volunteer in your role, right? To keep caring for them, to care for the other volunteers, to do your job, to put your heart into your job, and to not let this one volunteer kind of suck all the feelings and energy out of you, so that you've got nothing left to do all of the other million parts of your job. And so again, with people in our lives, with anything like that, you get to set that boundary. You don't have to kind of sit there and absorb all of their self-loathing, self-insecurity, whatever it might be. Like you can be there as a person who cares about them and show them care that way without needing to let them vent every thought about themselves that comes out. And it will take boundaries often take practice. So if you have that kind of relationship with them, it may have to be the sort of thing where they're like, they start to say it, and you're like, oh, like maybe you have a kind of like swear jar situation. I mean, don't really make them pay a quarter or anything, probably after they say that about themselves. But like, you can make it more of a lighthearted thing, but also you can stand firm on it. You have that right, and that is a very appropriate way to continue being able to draw on our care and our passion and our energy to give to others and the work that we do. So hopefully that is somewhat gives you some pieces to work with there. Um, for these last parts, and then you're welcome. We'll open it up at the end for any more questions. But in terms of laying the foundation, so there's some tangible action items that we can do, and part of it is laying the foundation and building the culture so that it exists already in our organization when new volunteers join, so that that foundation is already laid to support their mental health. And then the next piece is kind of maintaining it and taking continued action items within that. And so the 5 pieces I want to talk about under on this slide are learning, training, talking, accessibility, and culture building. So learning things like this, coming to trainings like this, reading up on mental health and mental illness, you can go to, like I said, to NAMI.org. There's fact sheets on every kind of official mental health diagnosis, and also and just really kind of easy to read. This is what it is. This is what symptoms can look like. This is often how it's treated or managed. Just that very basic cheat sheet to brush up on your own knowledge as a first step, so that you're not in a situation where like you have a volunteer who tells you that they have that they live with bipolar, and so they don't have to be the ones educating you on kind of the basics of bipolar, if this is the first time you've ever really known, to your knowledge. I'm sure you've known many people in your life, but they don't always tell us. So doing that learning, reading up as much as possible, learning, doing your own learning. Trainings, this can be an organization-wide thing as well. Kind of making sure that your other staff, because often volunteers come in contact not just with you, but with your colleagues and with other staff there. So making sure everyone there really has a solid knowledge and foundation of mental illness and mental health, so that they're reacting from a place, not from a place of bias or fear or discomfort or some of the other things that arise when mental health or mental illness are at play. Talking about it, as I said, sharing your own experiences, or talking about it in any way can really do wonders to open up that conversation and bring down stigma, even if we don't. It doesn't have to be much. We don't have to go into it. You don't have to share super personal things if you're not comfortable to. You may not feel safe sharing your own mental health experiences in terms of your job security, because we know that sharing information about your mental illness like absolutely has a negative impact on your career. Like, this is a documented thing, and that's part of what I personally, we as NAMI, hope to change by these workshops and our programs. But just talking about it, mentioning it, letting your volunteers know that that they are not the only one in the world or in your organization who, either living with a mental health condition or impacted by one. really, again, goes such a long way to open up those conversations and make that communication really honest and transparent and to the benefit of you, your volunteers, your organization. And it has a spillover effect to staff too, right? Because volunteers certainly aren't the only ones impacted by mental health conditions. Accessibility, thinking about your volunteer positions, are there ways that, we're limited right now in COVID times, certainly by factors, partly beyond our control, but do all of your volunteer opportunities, do they all start early in the morning? Are there ways that some can start later in the day? Do they all involve um, leaving your house and meeting with other people? Are there ways that people can work remotely? Obviously, that's a slightly different question during these times. Um, but are there ways that you can change up? Are there ways that instead of spoken interactions, they could be written? Or just thinking about all the different ways that the same work, the same projects can still get done, but are there ways that they can be tweaked to make them more accessible to folks who, as a side effect of their either mental health condition or their mental health medication, find it super hard to get up in really early in the mornings and get going, or who have a lot of anxiety about leaving their home, or just are there, or who forget a lot. Like a side effect of some mental health treatments is sort of loss of that short-term memory. um, are there ways that things could be written down? Just thinking about general mental health accessibility along with all other forms of disability accessibility. And then culture building, again, these are just sort of the intangible ways that that your organization explicitly and visibly and genuinely talks about mental health, supports mental health events out in the community, um, reaches out to do kind of mental health check-ins. Not even getting into the real deep health aspects of it, but just in general, we all have mental health, right? Whether or not we all have a mental health condition. So just kind of doing these check-ins. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Just how is that talked about and dealt with and treated within your larger organization? And talking also, I want to go back to number three. Talking can also be um, thinking about our choice of words, right? And so if you are a person who, or you're around a lot of people often who kind of throw around the words crazy or psycho or you know split personalities or insane, just as adjectives, which we all do because they're part of our cultural language. um, just kind of remembering, pausing yourself, remembering like, oh yeah, I just said blah blah blah. That was insane when that happened, and remembering that a lot of these words are really hurtful or traumatic or carry a lot of baggage for folks who struggled maybe in high school, which is when a lot of mental health conditions first start to emerge is during adolescence. And maybe like we have I have one colleague I work with who they were called, like their nickname was literally psycho in school because that's when their bipolar symptoms first started to emerge. And so like that word is incredibly triggering for them. And so, the amount of effort it takes me to kind of stop myself before I casually refer to something as psycho and find a different word is so little compared to the impact that my words or actions have. That, speaking specifically about words, just kind of being mindful that some folks don't care. For some folks living with bipolar, they may use psycho all the time and it makes no difference to them. For some folks it's really traumatic. And so just remembering like, okay, yeah, if I can just find another adjective and sort of sidestep that issue altogether and be causing someone less harm, then that also is a way of building the internal and external culture for your organization. And then finally, these last few action steps. And again, I'm sorry that I sort of am having to rush through these, but you are more than welcome to ask questions. I'll leave a few minutes for questions, and also you're always welcome to reach out to me. my email. I'm not sure if there's a way on the last slide. I'll pull it up since I can't share in chat, I don't think. But my email is just Katie, Katie, at NAMISeattle.org, and I'm happy to give more information or examples or answer any questions. But policies, volunteer policies. Do you mention mental health explicitly in your volunteer policies, even just kind of alongside health? Taking care of, if you have to step away from your volunteer role for health or mental health reasons. If you have anything like that in your volunteer policies that you can just kind of like stick the phrase mental health in to go along with health and really just reinforce, like, we as an organization, I as a volunteer manager think of mental health in the same way as I do health, right? This is all kind of taking care of ourselves, taking care of yourself. Um, are there other policies we have? I'm happy to share an example of some of NAMI Seattle's volunteer policies, but we acknowledge in there about how switching mental health medications can often have like very significant symptoms, or it can really be a struggle or have an impact on you. So we kind of mention that as well um, if you know that you have some, in our policies, we say something to the effect, I can't remember it right now, but if you know that you'll be having an experience, or if you're going through an experience in your personal life, or a medication change or anything like that that might impact your ability to volunteer, please do let us know, and we'll kind of work out a way for you to take a break or work on something else during that time and then come back to your role. And so just again, kind of acknowledging, like, as an organization, we get it, we support it, we know these things happen. Boundary setting, as actually that kind of ties back to the example I gave before. You can always set boundaries, the boundaries that you need as an organization, but just make sure that the boundaries that you're setting are set with compassion and also truly necessary, and not being set because you are uncomfortable, or you've got some biases coming up, or you just don't know how to deal with whatever is happening with this volunteer. um, Crises, kind of coming up with helping volunteers, supporting them through crises. The example I shared was a mild example of a crisis. It wasn't sort of an acute crisis so much as kind of a long-term crisis that they were dealing with in their own life. Um, but kind of figuring out, getting training for yourself, things like mental health first aid or other things to help you feel just more solid and equipped to deal with crises when and if they come up. Taking care of yourself, taking care of others, presenting things, approaching all of this work from a perspective of, how can we set this boundary or change things or create these policies to help you, volunteers, take care of yourself and your own mental health through this role. And then just connection, honesty and transparency and connection is even more important than it always is, and it's already important when mental health is concerned, because these symptoms and experiences can add so much complication and misunderstanding to a regular situation that might not be complicated to begin with. So I know, sorry, I had to rush a little bit through those, but again, you are welcome to follow up with me with any questions at all. I'm happy to share examples, talk more about this. I could really talk forever, so you are lucky that I'm having to cut myself off. I'm so glad to have been here with you today. There's a couple of minutes left if there's any last questions.
How to maintain confidentiality for volunteer trust.
Yes, I'm not sure I totally understand. Like if they confide in you, I'm guessing maybe like
Yeah,
if they.
why don't we start
Mhm.
there?
Yeah. Um, that is a great question. And again, I mean, I think I'm trying to think of an example. Maintain confidentiality for volunteer trust. Like if they share something with you that makes you uncomfortable. I mean, some of us, sometimes there's things we have to report if you're a mandated reporter personally or for our organization. Most of the time we don't need to report these things. And so I think it's kind of figuring out um, what are your own kind of limitations? What are your organization's limitations? Um, and then just being very clear and upfront with the volunteer. If they're sharing things that to you feels like too much information, just kind of kindly and caringly setting those boundaries, but also, helping, maybe doing that legwork to help connect them to another community resource, that might be able to help them, or they might be able, if they need that connection, or they need to confide, or they need more mental health care, or you're the only person in their life, if you're your organization is all that's in their life, if they're very isolated. Again, you can set those boundaries, but also I would encourage you to do more than just what we might do in professional situations, right? Which is kind of cut it off and leave it at that. But let them know, kind of, do help them find another resource that can help. I don't know if that answers your question. My apologies.
No, no, no.
But
Thank you so much for that. One other quick one.
yeah.
How much to divulge with when their family members inquired? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that is really hard. And I think, that varies by organization, to a certain extent, right? Sometimes we have policies. It depends what's going on. And I think also, depending on the situation, this may or may not be possible, again, depending on how much sort of lucidity or self-reflection the individual has about what their own behavior. But I think being as transparent as possible with the individual before talking to the family, um, is ideal, right? If you can let them know, and I know it gets complicated, and I'm trying to give sort of a one size fits all answer, and that doesn't always work. But I think to the extent that you can avoid kind of going behind their back and sharing information with their family, at least without giving them a heads up or being very transparent, like, hey, I'm concerned about you. Your family member reached out to me. They're concerned too, about what's going on, if that's possible. But yeah, it will also be impacted, I think, by your organization's policies. And if you don't have policies to that extent, and this is happening often enough that it might be helpful to you to create some internal guidelines or policies around it, then that might also be helpful. And I encourage you all to reach out. You have tons of NAMIs in Florida, and they can also hopefully provide a good resource and some more insight into that. Whether or not they offer workplace support trainings. In the same way that NAMI Seattle does. I think there's so many resources and so many folks with lived experience and expertise, within NAMI, who would be happy to share that guidance and knowledge. So hopefully that's also slightly helpful.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katie. We really appreciate this. So informative, tough things, but also really empowering things to be able to discuss. I hope everybody will go to event and then surveys, fill out a quick survey about this session. We would love to hear from you. Thank you again, Katie, for all of
Thank you all so much
your
for being here.
support and expertise. We're really appreciative.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay, take care.